Hello, welcome to video 4 of lesson 2, where in this video we will talk about the transport stock turnover method. This one is the same as the last video with the general stock turnover method, although it's a specialized method just used for mostly road transport. In this video, I will introduce you to the transport stock turnover method. I will tell you why we want to use this transport stock turnover method, because it is very useful, probably the most useful of stock turnover methods. I will talk briefly about how to get data, because there's an answer for that for transport, and the profiles we need to go through for transport stock turnover method. If you have watched the previous video, it's not much different, but it is very specifically related to transport, so there are some key differences. So if we come back to the lesson 1 chart, that was back then it was the same as before, but then for transport, so it is dependent on the sales here. So sales here, and then the development of the vintage related innovation. So it's basically innovation that we're inputting for the different vehicles. And that's the big thing about stock turnover analysis for vehicles. It is a method for representing innovation, both a bit in the past, but especially in the future, what we are thinking that will happen, and different alternatives in scenarios for that. So the reason for that is, well, things in transport change quite a lot. Not only are there significant differences from cars just 10 years ago or 20 years ago in terms of aerodynamics and general energy efficiency and how motors are built today, but also now we're seeing the emergence of a totally different technology, a general just innovation shift going from ICE vehicles towards battery electric vehicles, and maybe also soon hydrogen vehicles or hydrogen electric vehicles. At the same time, hybrids and plug-in hybrids that are differentiating technologies more and less have already found their place in modern vehicle systems, and those we already need now to make decisions for in a scenario in the future, and also to better and accurately represent and maybe judge the efficacy of using compared to normal vehicles. So stock turnover vehicle leap, that's represented by this little nice wheel up here. And as you can see in this window, I have made a few. I have even made some that are of different fuels, but we will look a little bit further into that later on. Oh, that was actually now, my bad. So here I have to pull some examples with different fuels. So we will get more into fuels today later, but this is the representative of the fuel, and this is the technology in itself where we also apply gas. One of the big things with this method is that we can really have if we have a bit of a shift between technology, we can accurately represent that by having the different technologies represented at the same time. So these are all cars, and that's usually how we would define them in a energy intensity method or even a total energy method. We would just define them as cars and define the fuels here between these, and then we would have minor changes year by year. But here we can have an actual representation of what's exiting the system and what's coming into the system, and is there not only energy efficiency differences, but is there fuel differences. And what you might have noticed is that here I have made something we haven't quite seen before. I have actually made a technology that has two different kinds of fuel, and these ones with different efficiency, because in this case for gasoline PHEV. So a plug-in hybrid electric vehicles is actually more or less two vehicles in one. It's both a electric vehicle and an ICE with the two different energy efficiency or fuel economy parameters that fit to these vehicles. So it's actually a bit of a mix. It's not just a mix of two vehicles, it is two vehicles in one, and we can accurately represent that quite well in this method. The other thing we can do, which is quite brilliant, is that gasoline, as we see, that we can change over time, because these two, the technology and the fuel, have been separated in this method. And that means this gasoline, for instance, that could be octane 100, or going from octane 88 towards octane 100, or maybe even more. It can go from around octane 90 towards something like E85, which is a mixed fuel. Were we to do that on a technology level, then we might not accurately gauge how much we would need of this new fuel, or how much we would save of fossil fuels. And as well, if you did it directly in a stock-to-nova methodology technology by itself, well, then only new vehicles would run on newer fuels, even though they go to the same pump. So by splitting these apart, we can now have a one track for vehicles where we have sales, life cycles, and exiting or retirement, and we can have another one for fuel where they change the different shares of the different components over time. That is represented in all cars, no matter the vintage. So that's quite something useful for this methodology. The fuel part we will get back to in lesson 3, maybe 2, later on in lesson 2 for this. Now, if you go over again, we can see, just like with the other stock-to-nova method, we have quite a lot of different parameters we can look at. So this is in current accounts, so we also have stock that only shows up in current accounts, but that is the stock of previous cars. And as you can see with stock, we do have a vintage profile, unsurprisingly. The ones that we have that has vintage profiles, those are stocks, sales, fuel economy, which you can see it is basically the same as the final marginal energy intensity, but fuel economy is a vehicle term, so that's what we use here. We also now have it for mileage, which is also a new parameter that's only relevant for vehicles. It is somewhat similar to usage factor-ish, but the usage of a consumer product in general is much more stable in general than it is for mileage. So we will start looking at especially these 4 is the ones that we're going to use for. Again, demand cost, we'll take that in lesson 3. So we will talk a bit about fuel economy, which is the same as the energy intensity in this case. So as you can see over here, we now have units that are very specialized for actually driving consumption. So it all depends on miles or kilometers or whatever your preferred unit is. The one thing that can be a little bit tricky is that the units we have now for both fuel economy and for fuel economy can be both positive and negatively related. So if we have miles per gallon, the higher miles per gallon, the better. But we also in this list have kilometers per liter. Sorry, that's the same. No, the liters per 100 kilometer, which is the reverse. So the more liters per 100 kilometers, the worse it is. So you can see that they're actually both represented more or less the same as same here. So that also have consequences for your degradation profile, if I'm not mistaken. Interestingly, we also have kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, which is a quite normal unit for electric vehicles. So that's also quite a good thing to have here. For electric vehicles, it might be quite noticeable that we don't have any thoughts on kilowatt hours of battery. And quite frankly, that's because we don't really care in LEAP. So here we don't have the battery state or the any thoughts on general battery sizes development, because we're only interested in the consumption. So you can have the same consumption with a battery that has 5 kilowatt hours that you charge 3 times a day and just drive, as one you have 20 and you drive longer for 15. That would technically be about the same energy consumption. So that's the only thing we care about in LEAP, because it is a consumption model. So that is generally the fuel economy. And here I think I took the I actually took the plug-in hybrid, which is, as you can see here, we actually have in this case we actually have 2 different fuel economies that also can be represented. It's not as obvious, but it can be represented with 2 different units in our vehicle, which means we can actually have the 2 vehicles in one, so to speak. That also means we can have 2 different degradation profiles. So we can actually have a vehicle that needs to have their ICE or gasoline motor changed after 10 or 15 years, but where the electric motor lives on more or less indefinitely. Again, with batteries, there's no thought on that unless the battery degradation would count as a catastrophic breakdown and it would hurt the survival profile. Other than that, we don't really care about batteries in the LEAP model itself. We do have had some thoughts on it, but we will get to that in lesson 4. And that's what I just told. But yeah. But the one thing we can also look at, which is quite interesting, is you can see we actually have, because we can have a number of different fuels, we could technically also make a car that runs on coal if that's what we want. LEAP won't stop us. We can see we also have it in equivalents, so we can have it in diesel equivalents, ethanol, and gasoline equivalents, and that actually is quite useful, especially when we're fuel shifting. It also means that we can have some of our results for different vehicles with different types of motors and different energy efficiency or fuel economies shown up directly related to each other. So if you input a modern electric car next to a old gasoline car or modern gasoline car, you can actually see what the actual energy efficiency is directly compared, and they are quite different. But of course, there's differences in how you can input and output these things on the demand side. So in terms of we have both EV degradation, or we have ICE degradation for these degradation profiles. So as mentioned, EV in general, they don't degrade. So EVs don't degrade. They're always constant, and electric motor is quite fantastic, and we don't care about batteries. While the ICE motors, they will clog up, they will be dirtier, they will have an increase in problems over the years. So we actually have 2 different ones for this. But you can see, just like with marginal profiles, we start 100 and then we in this case decrease because we're using a positively related fuel economy unit. So in terms of mileage is a new method that we're looking at. As you can see, just like with everything else, we have we have units that can be in any kind of length. The fact that it's in millimeter, maybe really don't drive a lot, but generally, of course, we would use mile and kilometers in this case. We also here have a degradation profile, which is quite interesting for miles, but we will look at that in a bit. But that's just really how long are you driving per year. So the mileage degradation profile might look something like this. In this case, I don't really differentiate between different kind of vehicle types. What this one states is that we are going to have the first year we are going to have the miles that we state in our mileage number of kilometers, and then the assumption is that the next few years you are going to increase your driving with that particular vehicle, and then it's going to decrease again. How well it fits to your country, I don't quite know. I have tried to look at why it looks like this. This is an inbuilt profile that Leap uses. I would maybe not use this profile, or I don't have a good reasoning behind it. And my reasoning I have gone to is that with the new car, you get quite a lot happy about it over the next few years, and then after 2 years, you might get a new car if you are a 2-car family that is then used for your longer distance trip because it's a newer car. And I think that's the reasoning I found so far. And then that will keep changing every other year, and then you will have it be sold at some point. But if you have a system where you have mostly 1-car families, or you have a 1-car, 1-scooter families, which is quite normal in quite a lot of countries, becoming normal in quite a lot of countries with a large urban area, then this might not really be the situation you have. It might be a more of a constant and then slightly declining profile, what I would guess. Now, sales, just like with the general structure number method, is the primary variable that we control. So in this case, we also have a survival profile, of course, which we can choose. And that can be different for the different vehicle types as well. I generally work with the same vehicle survival profile because it's actually, quite frankly, it's not usually technical breakdowns until very late in their life cycle. It's mostly, well, crashing truly that ruins vehicles. So this is or other provoked mechanical failures, such as flooding, which quite a lot of vehicles won't survive, or something similar. So here we have 3 different survival rates. I think that's the same as we showed in the last video. But these really show the differences between the different types of vehicles. So this, I think, is an example from Indonesia, where we have their much beloved motorcycles. They don't quite last that long. So after around, well, we get to the 50% point already after around 6 years, which shows that they're heavily used. With private cars, well, that 50% point comes only after around 13 years. So that's a pretty interesting development difference. I think I may have gone there might be 14 years instead. And then with trucks, well, they get repaired and get used for a long time because these are business investments that gets taken care of. So they last, their 50% survival rate is after 25 years. And you can see in this case, we actually just used the exponential formulas inbuilt, and then we found what we thought was the most representative. So of course this is not quite perfect, and it won't be. We're talking about future projections of survival. It is basically guesswork, maybe with some thoughts on how the survival have been so far. But of course there may have been special blip years. There might have been years with good economy where people have bought more expensive, high quality cars than that they had before. There might have been a regime change in terms of technologies. So maybe now electric motorcycles is coming online. That might look a little bit different because you can probably salvage the motor, use something else, but maybe the batteries only last a few years, but that's just a loose component you can change quite easily. So these might change quite a lot. But you could make different survival profiles for that. I don't think there's an upper limit to survival profiles, but we only use about 10 generally. Now, the benefits of the transport stock turnover method is quite a lot. In the projects that I have worked in with other countries, I almost always insist that we should have a transport stock turnover method in the model for road vehicles. One of the big ones is lag effect. Also, just clarity of data. I had a project where that was based on GDP and elasticity for motorcycle and vehicle ownership, and we found when I was further calculating a little bit that there would be more motorcycle, like the combination of motorcycle and four-wheeled private vehicles would have been 3.5, 4 per household, meaning 2 grown-ups and 2 children, meaning they should have 1.5 car each per household, and 3, I think it was 3 motorcycles per household, which is correctly franked either unrealistic or wasteful, but it was just not obvious in the data. That would have been showed very clearly have we used a stock turnover method, which they do now. So that's one of the benefits. The other big benefit is the lag effect that I talked about before. There's a lot of countries and a lot of areas that have goal setting right now for either hydrogen vehicles or BEV, battery electric vehicles, and those are usually based on stock. So these are what I would call stock-based policies. Now, quite often, maybe purposely or not, they don't have their sales built in. So if you need a certain stock or stock percentage in a number of years, well, how would you actually accomplish that in terms of sales? Would you do forced retirements? How much sales would you actually need to have a natural growth of a new technology, or just a different type of vehicles? That could be if you want to have a certain benchmarking, for instance 2030, of your fuel economy. Well, what do you have to do? Like, what is if that's what is comprised of the newest best cars today, but the average is a little different of new cars, well, how would you have to change your vehicle purchase decisions in your area to make that goal fit? Those you can usually see out of stock policies, which means you do have to calculate, and then you can change in sales. But again, LEAP is very quick to calculate, and especially if you just take off transformation and resources, so you only calculate demand, then you can turn this, dial it in, so to speak, to where your perfect sales are compared to the stock or stock percentage that you want to have. I will make a video where we look a little bit more on this, on just of how we look at different results and how we can find the things we want in results after this lesson. So I will do that probably after the Q&A, or we will do it at Q&A. So the fuel economy in terms of transport is directly built in, which means it is a direct number that you can just look up. So that is quite a big benefit. That is a new vehicle that you can see in your Toyota or Nissan or GMC catalogs directly. So that's quite beneficial. You can separate, like as I alluded to, you can separate, there's a separation between fuel and vehicle, which is quite beneficial, especially if you have something like PHEVs. But that also in other cases can be a bit of a detriment, because there are some places with especially fuel, mixed fuels that LEAP doesn't quite account for it. And that means if you have mixed fuels, the vehicle or the motor technology does not necessarily, their fuel economy doesn't necessarily change with the fuel. You can kind of force it, but you have to make a function for that. So a ICE engine will have a worse fuel economy per liter of ethanol than per liter of gasoline, and that's, since they're totally separated in this case, that doesn't actually show up in the model necessarily. So we might discuss how we can deal with that later on. I just want to show you lag effects. So this is from a system I have. So in this case, we have 3 different competing technologies for cars. This in this case is the rise of electric vehicles that we see, if I'm not mistaken. And this down here is diesel. It's a small share. It only grows together with the general vehicle sales growth that we have. You can see that from the total line up here. But what we can really see is that the gasoline part of this really shrinks because the share is quite a lot less. And as we can see with this, which is the important part, this is the vehicle sales. So in this case, I think the EV in this 2050 case scenario, that in 2050, there we are at, the 50% of all vehicle sales here are BEV, for instance. So that sounds like a general policy target, like 50% in 2050. That's fine. But is that stock target? We have a problem. Because then if we change here, we can see this is the exact same data, but it's just the difference between sales and now stock. Here we can already see that that the gasoline car provides or is still quite a high share, around 50%. I think it's 45 to 50%. 50, right? Proper, good. 50%. That's still gasoline in 2050. While in this case, if I'm not mistaken, the BEV is only around 38%. And why is that? Well, they have the same lifetime. So some of them will already have exited if they were sold early on, but mostly it just takes some time because the gasoline cars have not exited the system yet, and therefore the whole system lags quite the whole stock in terms of the system, how it actually looks on the road looks quite different than what it looks for in sales or in the sales department of a dealership. So the dealership might sell 50% electric vehicles, but on the roads it's still like it's only a little bit above a third of the vehicles that are BEV, just because it's going to take some time. So you can really see there's quite a pronounced lag effect for these vehicles. And now just to show that more directly, and I was right, it was 38%. So here we have the EV sales and the EV stocks of the same system that I showed, and you can see how they almost have the same trajectory going up, but it's just lagging a good 15 years behind. And why is that? Because it takes around 15 years before the majority of vehicles of the other type, in this case gasoline, have exited the system. So lag effect. It's quite pronounced. The other thing we can say is we also have a lag effect in the fuel economy. So here we have, it doesn't really show up for electric vehicles because electric motors are wonderful. So, but for diesel vehicles and gasoline vehicles, we can say that, for instance, here we have some quite pronounced assumption of what can happen to gasoline vehicles and diesel vehicles. These are a lot of this is just general aerodynamic improvements and some existing technologies that we think can improve quite a lot. And then at some point in around 5 years, this is going to plan out a lot more. Of course, this could be a smoother chart, but that's not the point here. The point here is because we have the same sales stock lag effect. So here we have the fuel economy in kilometers per liter gas equivalent for new diesel cars versus for the average stock. So that means, and as you can see, there is a really big lag between a new car in something like 2025 and the average, and that's just because most of the stock at this time is so old compared to, like, the fuel economy is so bad because of the age compared to a new car. It is only when we have had this more or less stagnant. So you can see this is around 2025 in this case, and these line up quite well within basically 5% in about 2037 or 8. So that means it takes, well, basically 15 years before they have lined up. And again, that's when the existing cars, a majority of the existing cars have exited the system. For gasoline, where we have a little bit of a smoother progression, there's a bit smoother progression in this line up here, still progression good upwards. It takes also a lot longer before we reach something that we will be happy with, just with 16 kilometers gasoline equivalent. Approaching that above basically 15. So that is quite a lot of lag effect, and that, for an energy efficiency point of view, can be a bit of a bad surprise if you don't, because it's hidden if you don't have a stock turnover model. So this is one of the benefits of doing that.